Here's something the NHRA will never put in a press release. Over the course of 30 years, one man kept getting faster. One man kept getting smarter. One man kept showing up to the national event with a car that nobody else could touch. And every single time that happened, every time Warren Johnson found an edge and started pulling away from the field, the rulebook got a little heavier. 6 championships, 97 wins, the second most victories in pro stock history, and at least 8 times 8 documented moments where the NHRA sat down, looked at what Warren Johnson was doing, and decided that whatever he had figured out this time needed to be illegal. He never stopped. He never complained publicly anyway. He just went back to his shop in Beaufort, Georgia, fired up the dyno, and found another way. This is the story of 8 times NHRA changed the rules to stop Warren Johnson. Warren Johnson didn't just race pro stock. He built pro stock, engineered it, pushed it, defined what was possible in the class at every turn. And in return, the NHRA spent 3 decades trying to figure out how to slow him down. Here's how it went. 8 times. Rule change in. Number 1, the weight brake system that pushed him out, mid-1970s, before Warren Johnson became the 6-time champion of anything, before the Oldsmobile Cutlass, before the 200 miles per hour barrier, before anyone called him the professor. He was a young racer from Virginia, Minnesota, driving a big block Chevrolet Camaro on the NHRA Tour in the mid-1970s. And he was fast, genuinely, undeniably, uncomfortably fast. In 1976, his first full season competing seriously on the NHRA circuit, Warren Johnson finished 2nd in the world in pro stock points. Not 3rd, not 5th, 2nd. In his first real year, with no factory backing, with no major sponsor. With an engine he'd built himself in a shop that most of his established competitors would have laughed at. The NHRA's pro stock class at that time was governed by a complex, constantly shifting system of weight brakes, essentially a handicapping formula that applied different minimum weights to different engine and car combinations. The stated purpose was competitive balance. The practical effect was that every time one combination started dominating, the weight brake formula got adjusted to penalize it. Johnson's big block Camaro combinations. On kept running into these adjustments. Every season the formula shifted. Every season the advantage he'd built through superior engineering and relentless testing got quietly erased by a number in the rulebook. He fought it for several seasons, running a 1976 season that should have earned him the championship or at minimum made him a nationally recognized name in the class. Instead, the ever-shifting weight brakes kept him in the shadow of better-funded factory-backed competitors. By 1979, Warren Johnson had had enough. He packed up his operation and left the NHRA, entirely moving to the IHRA, where the Mountain Motor Pro Stock class ran bigger engines with more freedom and less political interference in the rulebook. He won the IHRA championship in 1979, and again in 1980. 2 titles in 2 years in a class where he was competing against engines displacing 700 cubic inches with his own 452 cubic inch combination. 2 titles that proved, beyond any reasonable argument, that the man sitting behind the wheel of that Chevrolet was not the problem. The NHRA's weight brake system was. Number 2, the 500 cubic inch 2,350 pound formula, 1982. Johnson came back to the NHRA in 1980. 2. Not because the weight brakes were gone, but because they were finally being replaced by something he could plan around. For 1982, the NHRA scrapped the old weight brake system entirely and introduced a single standardized formula. 500 cubic inch maximum displacement, 2,350 pound minimum weight. Every car, every engine, every manufacturer, same number. No more adjustments. No more shifting formulas mid-season. On paper, this was the fairest system the class had ever used. But it came with a side effect that Johnson recognized immediately, and that his competitors were slower to understand. Under the old system, Johnson had been running a relatively small displacement engine at a favorable weight. Under the new 500 cubic inch rule, everyone had to run the same displacement. The advantage now belonged entirely to whoever built the best 500 cubic inch engine. Warren Johnson built the best 500 cubic inch engine. He won his first NHRA national event in 1982, his very first season back. He didn't win a championship that year. Lee Shepherd and the Raher Morrison team were in the middle of their historic 4-year run. But Johnson was consistently fast, consistently on the pole. Cons. Instantly making everyone in the paddock uncomfortable. The 500 cubic inch formula was supposed to level the playing field. Instead, it handed the keys to the kingdom to a man who had spent the previous decade learning to extract more power from less cubic inches than anyone thought was possible. The professor had done his homework, and the test was finally written in a language he could ace. Number 3, the pneumatic valvetrain ban, early 1990s. This one never made the headlines. It never got a big NHRA press release or a formal announcement at a rules meeting. But in the drag racing community, among the engineers and the engine builders who understood what Warren Johnson had done, this was one of the most significant suppressions of innovation in pro stock history. In the early 1990s, Johnson was running his engines at RPM levels that were creating a specific, well-understood problem: valvetrain control at high RPM. Steel valve springs, even the best ones available, have physical limitations. At a certain RPM threshold, the number Johnson was approaching, the springs can no longer reliably control the valves. Float occurs. Power drops. Engines fail. Formula One had already solved this problem. The solution was the pneumatic valve spring, replacing the steel coil with compressed air, which has no resonant frequency and can maintain valve control at RPM levels far beyond what any steel spring could manage. Not a revolutionary concept, not exotic technology, a known, proven engineering solution. Warren Johnson built one. He developed a pneumatic valvetrain system for his pro stock engine that would have allowed him to run reliably at 14,000 RPM, an astronomical figure for a naturally aspirated 500 cubic inch race engine at the time, when his competitors were struggling to maintain reliability at anything approaching those numbers. The NHRA looked at what Johnson had built and banned it. No official explanation that satisfied engineers was ever given. The system was classified as not in the spirit of the class. The practical effect was that Johnson had solved a problem everyone in the class had and been told he wasn't allowed to use the solution. He adapted. He always adapted. But those who understood what he'd built knew exactly what had happened. The professor had gotten too far ahead of the class, and the class had drawn a line. Number 4, the Olds. Mobile body discontinuation problem. This rule change didn't come in the form of a new technical regulation. It came in the form of a corporate decision that NHRA stood behind and that hit Warren Johnson harder than almost anyone else in the class. Throughout the 1990s, Johnson had competed primarily in Oldsmobile-branded cars, first the stunning Cutlass that won him his first championship in 1992, then subsequent Oldsmobile models as GM updated their product lineup. His relationship with Oldsmobile and GM performance was deep and foundational. The DRCE engine, the drag race competition engine that became the backbone of pro stock racing, had originally been developed as an Oldsmobile program. Johnson had been instrumental in its creation from the beginning. In 2000, General Motors discontinued the Oldsmobile brand entirely. NHRA rules required pro stock cars to be based on production vehicles that were currently manufactured. No production Oldsmobiles meant no legal Oldsmobile pro stock car. A brand that Johnson had helped make synonymous with dominance in the class simply ceased to exist as a competitive option. Competitors who had been running Pontiac Firebirds or Chevrolet Camaros were unaffected. Johnson, whose entire program had been built around the Oldsmobile nameplate and his relationship with that division of GM, had to make an abrupt transition. He switched to Pontiac. He kept winning. He won the championship in 2001, his sixth and final title in a Pontiac Trans Am. But the disruption was real, the timing was brutal, and the NHRA's insistence on enforcing the current production vehicle rule to the letter gave Johnson's well-funded competitors exactly the kind of window they needed to close the gap. He papered over the crack, but the crack was real. 4 rule changes down, 4 to go. And the next 4, these are the ones that made Warren Johnson the loudest voice in the pro stock paddock. Not just fast, not just dominant, but angry. Publicly on the record, repeatedly angry, because the next 4 rule changes weren't just inconvenient, they were personal. Number the 10,500 RPM cap. For most of his career, Warren Johnson ran his engines at RPM levels his competitors couldn't match. Higher RPM within the limits of reliable valvetrain control means more power cycles per second, which means more horsepower at the top of the power band. It's basic physics, and Johnson understood it better than anyone in the class. By the 2000s, competitive pro stock engines were approaching and exceeding 11,000 to 12,000 RPM in race trim. The engineering required to maintain reliability at those numbers was extraordinary and expensive. Johnson's shop had the knowledge to do it. His DRCE-based engines were at the cutting edge of what was possible within the rules. In 2016, as part of a sweeping overhaul of the pro stock class that introduced electronic fuel injection and an electronically controlled throttle body system, the NHRA simultaneously implemented a hard 10,500 RPM limit enforced electronically through the new ECU system that every car was now required to run. The stated reason was cost reduction and safety. The practical effect was that every team in the class was now limited to the same maximum RPM ceiling, and the teams that had been running the most reliable, most powerful high RPM combinations had their primary advantage capped by a computer. Johnson publicly called the rule out. He had been one of the most vocal critics of NHRA rule changes throughout his career. Officials had long been reluctant to visit his pit area because he never hesitated to say exactly what he thought, and the RPM cap was no exception. His moper-running competitors were hit even harder. The 10,500 RPM limit made the existing GM-based DRCE platform with its architecture optimized for the small bore, short-stroke, high RPM combination the default winning platform, while Dodge Hemi teams that had been competitive suddenly found themselves structurally disadvantaged. Warren Johnson had spent 40 years building engines that could spin higher and harder than anything else on the property. The ECU put a number on the tachometer, and the number wasn't his. Number 6 body template restrictions that targeted his aerodynamics mid-1990s throughout the 1990s. Warren Johnson wasn't just winning with a better engine, he was winning with a better car. His Oldsmobile Cutlass had exceptional aerodynamics for a pro stock vehicle, a fact that Johnson had carefully exploited through painstaking attention to body preparation, panel alignment, and the subtle shaping of surfaces that the rules didn't explicitly restrict. He was the first pro stock driver to break 180 miles per hour at Fremont in 1982. The first to break 190 miles per hour at Indianapolis in 1986. In 1998, he recorded top speed at 21 of 22 events on the entire calendar. Not occasionally the fastest, not usually the fastest. The fastest at 21 out of 22 stops on the national tour. Speed like that doesn't come from horsepower alone. It comes from how cleanly the air moves around a body at 200 miles per hour. The NHRA introduced increasingly strict body template regulations through the mid and late 1990s, specific aluminum templates that inspectors would place on the car's body surfaces to verify that nothing had been massaged beyond its production shape. Any panel that didn't match the template within tight tolerances had to be corrected before the car could compete. The practical effect was that teams who had been exploiting subtle aerodynamic effects were able to gain an advantage. Advantages in how their bodies were prepared, particularly in areas like the roofline, the windshield angle, and the rear deck, lost those advantages overnight. Johnson's program, which had been among the most aerodynamically refined in the class, took a direct hit. He adapted. He was still the fastest car at most events, but the gap between his program and the best of his competitors narrowed measurements. Undoubtedly after the template rules tightened, and everyone who had been watching the speed trap numbers over the previous decade knew exactly why. Number 7, the engine body manufacturer matching rule. In 2018, the NHRA introduced what many observers considered the most sweeping rule change to pro stock in a generation. For the first time, teams were required to run an engine manufactured by the same company as their car body. Chevrolet engine in a Chevrolet body, Dodge engine in a Dodge body, Ford engine in a Ford body. This sounds simple, logical even. But for Warren Johnson and the legacy of the DRCE program he'd spent decades developing, the implications were significant. The DRCE engine, all 4 generations of it, had been developed under the Oldsmobile and then Chevrolet banner within GM. But the architecture of the DRCE was fundamentally a big block Chevrolet derivative. Teams running Pontiac or Oldsmobile bodies had been able to use DRCE engines because they were all GM products. When Oldsmobile died and Pontiac was discontinued in 2010, the pool of eligible GM body styles shrank. More critically, the new engine body matching rule eliminated any possibility of cross-manufacturing. Conductor experimentation that Johnson had spent his career pushing. The class was now formally siloed by manufacturer, and the infrastructure that supported Chevrolet-based programs, including the DRCE supply chain that Johnson had helped build from scratch, became the de facto standard because it was the most developed and most supported. Dodge Hemi teams, which had been fighting for relevance since the RPM cap, were now also forced to rely on a less developed engine platform without the depth of support that the DRC ecosystem provided. Johnson came out publicly against the rule. He told NHRA directly that the change created artificial competitive imbalance rather than resolving it. The sport, he argued, would be better served by letting engineers compete on merit rather than being forced into manufacturer boxes. The NHRA implemented it anyway. Number 8, the EFI overhaul that ended the carburetor era for over 40 years, from the moment Pro Stock was created in 1970 until the 2015 season ended. Every competitive Pro Stock car in the NHRA had been fed by carburetors. 2 4-barrel Holley Dominators, sitting on top of an intake manifold, doing what carburetors have done since. Into the invention of the internal combustion engine mixing fuel and air through purely mechanical means. Warren Johnson had spent his entire career mastering the carburetor, not just tuning it, understanding it at a level that his competitors could only estimate. His knowledge of fuel delivery, air-fuel ratios, accelerator pump circuits, and the interaction between carburation and the rest of the engine system was legendary in the paddock. People who worked with him described it as an almost supernatural intuition, the ability to feel what a carburetor was doing through a set of elapsed times and know exactly what adjustment was needed. In 2016, the NHRA mandated a complete conversion to electronic fuel injection throttle body EF systems with an electronically controlled ECU, standardized across the class. The hood scoops disappeared. The Holley Dominators disappeared. 40 years of accumulated carburation knowledge, Johnson's single greatest technical advantage over teams that had started racing recently and hadn't built that knowledge base over decades, disappeared with them. The NHRA framed the change as modernization, making Pro Stock relevant to contemporary automotives. IVE technology, moving the class into the 21st century? What it actually did was erase the institutional knowledge advantage that Warren Johnson had spent 40 years building and replace it with a software and electronics platform where every team started from roughly the same place. Johnson was publicly critical. He had always been publicly critical when he believed the rules were wrong. He went on record stating his concerns about the direction of the class and the effect of the EF mandate on teams that had built their programs around carburation expertise. He wasn't wrong. He was just outvoted. And in 2013, 3 years before the carburetors actually disappeared, Warren Johnson had already quietly stepped away from full-time competition. Perhaps he saw it coming. Or perhaps he'd simply decided that a class that kept changing its rules every time he figured something out wasn't worth figuring out anymore. 8 rule changes. 30 years. 1 man. And here's what makes Warren Johnson's story different from every other driver on this list of someone getting stopped by a rulebook. He never stopped winning. Every time they changed the rules, he came back. Every time they added an RPM range or banned a valvetrain system or eliminated his body style or replaced his carburetors with electronics, he showed up at the next national event, qualified at the top of the sheet, and went rounds. 6 championships. 97 victories, the second most wins of any driver in Pro Stock history, against a rule book that was rewritten at least in part specifically to slow him down. 8 documented times. Other drivers won despite the competition. Warren Johnson won despite the rules. That's not a racer. That's a force of nature that even the NHRA couldn't legislate away. If this is the kind of story you come to this channel for, hit that subscribe button. Because next time we're going inside the biggest dynasty in pro stock history, the one that didn't end with a rule change, or a retirement, or a graceful exit. It ended with a hammer. I'll see you there.